Good morning. This is Ellen again from Camden, Arkansas, First United Methodist Church. Welcome to Sunday School. And let me just say, I'm going to start with a wonderful chapter from this book. I think last week I held it where you couldn't see it. I hope we're doing better. I may come up a little bit there. The book by Scott Jones and his son Arthur Jones is called Ask: Faith Questions in a Skeptical Age. I don't want to sound like a book salesman, but I must say the chapter that we're going to discuss today, these guys did such a great job with it. If you don't have the book, it is available on almost any online place that you can get books. You can get it as a paperback or an ebook like a Kindle or other formats. I highly recommend it. It's good reading, and it's actually, I hope I don't sound like a nerd, but it's actually fun reading. Well, let me begin today. I'm going to read to you from Acts chapter 17, beginning with verse 22. And what's going on here is that Paul is in Athens and has been taken up to the Areopagus and is being questioned about his faith by these very curious Athenians. And here's one of the things that Paul says to them, or the beginning of what he says. Paul stood in the middle of the council on Mars Hill, and he said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I've even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made with human hands. Nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so that they would seek him, perhaps even reach out to him and find him. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God we live, move, and exist, as some of your poets have said. We are God's offspring." I read that to you because I think what I liked about it was the fascinating thought that Paul has, that God made us humans so that we are seeking and groping and struggling to find him. And God welcomes that seeking. Paul is complimenting these people because they are so interested in religion, they're so interested in finding out about God and about truth, that they even have erected a temple to an unknown God, in case there's a God they don't know about. What a wonderful journey of faith it will become for these people. So the question today, the chapter heading for the book was, can I believe in a God that I cannot prove? Like last week, I can tell you that actually has a pretty simple answer. Well, let me back up and say this a different way. If I ask the question, could I prove that God exists, then the answer is pretty simple. No, you can't prove that God exists, but you also cannot disprove that God exists. You see me shuffling with this? I made myself an outline that I told myself I would follow this week because there's so much here. As a matter of fact, this chapter has so much material in it that is so interesting that there's no way in the world I could summarize it. If I tried to talk about everything that was in there, I would be here all day. I would be here all day, and you guys would have turned me off a long time ago and gone outside to enjoy this beautiful Mother's Day. But what makes us have this question anyway? How can I believe in a God that I can't prove? Well, partly I think it's because of what I call modern doubt, a doubt that was born in our ability to reason and think. We begin to look at the world around us. We learn more and more through science, and we begin to see how beautifully things are put together, but we also come up with explanations for things that we couldn't understand before, so that a thunderstorm is not some active and angry God, but has to do with weather patterns and winds and cold and warm winds coming together, that sort of thing. And it makes us begin to question all of our premises and beliefs about God. And I think the other thing that has happened that makes for so much skepticism in this day is that unfortunately, Christians can sometimes be extremely judgmental and extremely lacking in compassion towards those who do not believe or who are struggling with belief. So that because you don't believe as I do, as some Christians will do, you don't believe as I do, I look down on you. I tisk you. I think you're somehow less human than I am. That's the impression that people who are not Christians often get, unfortunately, from Christians. And it makes them turn sour against God. And then they ask a very reasonable question. How can I believe in a God, or can I believe in a God that I cannot prove? Now that question doesn't just come from people who are angry or turning against us, but also from people who are simply curious. I'm guessing that if you're watching this program, you probably believe in God. But maybe you have entertained this question yourself before. Maybe you have encountered others who have this question. I can tell you that you could spend all day advancing logical and illogical arguments, and you'll never be able to prove to someone that God exists. Nor is just coming at them with all this theory and speculation, nor is that helpful in convincing somebody to have faith in God or faith in Jesus Christ. I was talking about modern skepticism, and again, reading in this wonderful book here, the authors brought up a little passage out of a novel by C.S. Lewis. It was written in 1953. It's called That Hideous Strength. There's a scientist in the book. His name is Andrew McPhee. And here's what he says about believing in God or anything else that he can't see. If anything wants Andrew McPhee to believe in its existence, well, I'd be obliged if it would present itself in full daylight with a sufficient number of witnesses present, and not get shy if I hold up a camera or a thermometer. There's that quest, that desire to prove something that cannot be proved. Because we can't ever completely and definitively prove there is a God, but we cannot prove there is not a God. Those who would say there is not a God, as these authors call it, they call that the no God belief. And that comes from the fact that we have this material world around us, we look at it, we can measure it, we can get objective data, and so we sometimes begin to believe that this material world is all that there is, that nothing else could possibly exist. But if you go with that concept, you get to what I might think could be slightly illogical, and that is that everything that came to be, the universe and all that is within it, just is some accidental happenstance. And of course, you keep tracing it back, you wonder, where did the everything come from to begin with? Which gets me to the logic in Christianity. Can we prove a God? Can we prove Christianity? Again, no, you can't entirely. You can use deductive reasoning, you can use inductive reasoning, but you can only go so far. So let me say, I think using inductive reasoning, we can at least come up with the plausible idea that there might be a God or a creator. So I'm going to give you a little short lesson in philosophy, as if I were some kind of philosophy major, which I'm not. I took a class in philosophy, so does that make me an expert? No. But deductive logic is maybe a hard way to get to proof of God. In deductive logic, if the premises are true and the logical argument is sound, then the conclusion has to be true. And the classic example that's given for that is, listen to this now, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, yes, if the first premise is true, that all humans are mortal, and the second, that Socrates is a human, then the logical conclusion is that he is mortal. The problem is, even though that's perfectly good deductive logic, the first premise, that all humans are mortal, is actually based on inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, you get a series of examples, enough of them that you draw a conclusion about the general class. How do we know that all humans are mortal, that all humans are going to die? Well, we know it because every human that came before us has died. From as far back as we can go in history, people have died, so therefore we conclude that all humans will die, which is a great and logical inductive leap. But you can't prove it completely because you'd have to wait for every person to die, and then you wouldn't be around to prove it. So that's inductive logic. But inductive logic looks at all the things out here, these instances or examples, and draws a conclusion. Can we use inductive logic to show us that there is a God? Somewhat. And I say that because we can look at the vastness of the universe. We can look at the complexity of the universe. We can look at the beauty of creation. We can look at the intricacies of things like DNA and the way that we humans are genetically connected to everything else in the planet. And we can conclude from all those things there seems to be a reasoning power, a creating power behind all this. That's still a leap of faith, which is always required if we're going to use logic. Using another form or a deeper form of logic are two writers in the church that have been looked at for a long time. I want to make sure I get their names right. 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, and Anselm, who was an 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury. Both of them have written works that are often looked to as ways to prove God. Again, remember, it's still a leap of faith. And I don't have time to go into great depth about what they said, but I can tell you, I studied both of these guys in my philosophy class in college, and I was very impressed with the way the authors of this book were able to take their very complex ideas and boil them down in a few pages. The reading was fun, it was fascinating, so I know I sound like a book advertisement, but I highly recommend that you read it. I'm just going to give you one example of some of the ways that Thomas Aquinas tries to help bring us to the logical conclusion that there is a God. One of those is what is known as the first cause. And what Aquinas says is that everything is known to have a cause, and that thing cannot cause itself. A thing cannot cause itself to exist. So to give a simple example, you could not make yourself be born. You could not birth yourself because you would have had to exist before you were born in order to do that. Okay. And so likewise is true of the universe. If it exists, then there was a first cause that brought it into existence. That's the concept. He has another one that has to do with motion. If something is in motion, then something caused the motion to begin. And so he says the same about the motion of the universe, the motion of this world. Something caused that to happen. And that's what we describe as God. Anselm discussed something that he called, let me make sure I get it the way that it's worded. Wait, don't go anywhere for just a minute. Here we go. Something than which a greater cannot be thought. I know that's kind of awkward sounding, but listen to it again. We are able as humans to conceive of something than which a greater cannot be thought. Because we can't think of something greater than that. If we can conceive of something that is greater than all things, then even our conception is not as great as the something that is greater than all things. Am I confusing you yet? Again, read the book. They do a much better job. But Anselm uses that to show us that there's a possibility, because we can conceive of God, because we can conceive of perfection, or I should put it, that God exists. If I can conceive of imperfection, then it suggests that there is perfection somewhere for me to be comparing that to. Again, those are all matters of still requiring a leap of faith, but I think the point I want to make from that, even if I don't make it very well, and by the way, if this is not a good lesson, don't invite anybody to look at it. If you enjoy it, smile and love your Lord. Okay, well, that was my little aside, not an advertisement, to be sure. Where was I? Why do we get here? We're not going to be able to convince somebody. We're not going to be able to hit someone over the head with our Bible or tisk somebody with our looking down our nose at them and convince them that there is a God. That's not going to happen. I think it's useful for us to be aware of this information. I think it's useful for you to read a chapter like that one. And I don't know necessarily that you run out and you find those people you know who don't believe and say, you need to read this. But if someone is curious, you have a place you can point them. And although not everybody comes around because of a logical argument, some people have. One of those was the C.S. Lewis I was quoting from earlier, who became a great theologian. And he actually did that after reading some of these logical arguments we've talked about. But what gets us there, partly, is the fact that non-believers are encountering Christians who are judgmental and who give them the feeling that, well, if you don't believe like I do, or if you don't believe this literally the way I do, there's something wrong with you. Friends, you never influence people with judgmentalism. You never pull people to God with judgmentalism. And let me just give you an example of someone who dealt with sinners, someone who dealt with doubters, and someone that we can model ourselves after. And that is Jesus Christ. Look in the Gospels. Jesus eats with all the bad people. He eats with sinners. There's no doubt that some of those people don't even believe in God. He encounters Thomas. You remember the famous story of the doubting Thomas and how Thomas says, unless I see him for myself and put my hand in his side, I won't believe. And he encounters Thomas. He meets with all those sinners. And he does it without judgmentalism. He does it without saying, look, I'm Jesus and you have to believe everything I tell you or I'm not going to eat dinner with you. He doesn't do that. He simply loves. He shares God's love. He reaches out in love. When Jesus tells Thomas, for example, come and touch my hands and put your hand in my side, he's not scolding Thomas. He's helping Thomas to believe. Do not doubt, Thomas, but believe. That's not scolding. That's longing on the part of Jesus for Thomas to have the joy of believing. And speaking of this makes me lead on to another thing. We can entertain this question about whether I can believe in a God I can prove, not only so that we can answer other people who are curious, other people who are non-believers, but so that we can deal with our own doubts. If we are thinking, living human beings, we are going to occasionally have doubts. Faith is not just one instantaneous turn and never look back. Ideally, it would be. But the truth of the matter is, if we're honest with ourselves, whether we're honest with anyone else about this, but if we're at least honest with ourselves, we will have doubts. That's part of being human. I can remember years ago that I was in a small church where we had a retired pastor. Now, this man had been a United Methodist pastor for 50 years. And during the time he was with us, his wife died. About 2 months or so after this man's wife died, the man's son said to me, have you noticed that all of Daddy's sermons lately are about an afterlife? Ellen, he said to me, it's as if Daddy is trying to convince himself. Of course, he experienced doubt. That's part of being human. God didn't give us a brain never to use it. It's going to happen. What we need to do is not scold ourselves when we're feeling doubt. We need to hear Jesus reaching towards us as he did to St. Thomas and say to us, don't doubt, but believe. Know that I love you. I'm thinking now of a wonderful story. I don't know if any of you have ever watched. It was on Masterpiece Theater and is repeating right now on Arkansas PBS. Lark Rise to Candleford. There's a scene in one of the shows where another Thomas, his name is Thomas Brown, he's the very upright Christian, kind of scoldy, looking askance at everyone else who doesn't do exactly what they're supposed to do. But he begins to experience doubts. And because he becomes fierce in trying to defend his faith. So he actually, I lost my word there. Oh, there it is. He actually scolds the priest one day, or the pastor, who Thomas takes exception to something that the pastor has said, and he begins to say, what you were preaching could cause a person to doubt. I want you to listen to this exchange now. The pastor says to him, well, faith is not a fixed theme, Thomas. It is a seeking. Thomas answers, faith, sir, is a rock. It is a mast. It is a tower of strength. The pastor says, for me, Thomas, it is an adventure. I do not see it as permanent. It vanishes, and I must find it again daily. Vanish? Faith? Doubt is a gift, Thomas. We can dare to admit it. Doubt, sir, is the same as disbelief. That's Thomas. He's afraid to doubt. He thinks that doubting is the same as disbelief. And he is in for a rough night, a rough couple of days. Because doubting is something that comes to people of faith. And it seems sometimes that the more faithful someone is, the more someone is living their faith, sometimes the more the doubt comes. After many years after Mother Teresa died and her journals were read, it was discovered that she went months and months on end, plagued with doubt, feeling that she could not find God. Of course, God had not left her, but sometimes we get to that place. So here is what a group of young pastors suggested, and let me tell you who this group of young pastors are. The video that comes with this wonderful series got a group of young pastors, 30-ish, like 32 or so, together and just had questions in a box. Poof, here are some questions. And so they had this question, can I believe in a God that I cannot prove? And they discussed that for a while and discussed why we want proof. But finally, one of them came down to this. He said that though rationality and using our brain is good, we can sometimes get into the rut of thinking, and sometimes we just need to set that all aside and just begin faith practices. Just begin serving, begin worshiping, begin praying without needing the proof. And see if these avenues don't point you towards an answer in a way that rationality hasn't. If we find ourselves struggling with doubt, what this young pastor was saying is, let's just set that aside for a moment. Let's not try to prove everything. Let's not try to pretend we don't doubt. Let's just start living our faith. John Wesley, who is now considered a great sort of saint of the church, John Wesley himself struggled with doubts. And when he talked to a pastor about it, this is the advice he got. Keep preaching faith until you find faith. And he discovered, Wesley did, that did work for him eventually. So when we have doubts, when we don't know if we can prove the existence of God, let's get out there and serve. Because I guarantee you, friends, if you get your hands out there, you get your feet out there, if you take yourself to the place where you can encounter Christ, you will begin to believe. And where, you say, can I encounter Jesus Christ? Well, he tells us in Matthew 25. When he says, when the people say to him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and give you something to eat? When did we see you thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you naked and feed you? When did we see you sick and in prison and visit you? And friends, what was his answer? When you did this for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. If we want to encounter the Christ, if we want to move past doubt, if we want to move into great love, then what we do is we just get out there and we begin to serve. It may be that our motives are not pure when we start. It may be that we're trying to convince ourselves. It may be that our brain tells us we should serve and our heart hasn't gone there yet. But just let go and start serving and loving. Serve in the way that you can. If you're cooped up in the house now because you can't get out, get on that telephone and call other people and share God's love with them. Because it is when we begin to empty ourselves in love, when we begin to empty ourselves in service for other people, that we most dearly encounter the Christ and the God that lives within us. Because God is a God of love. And even as God pulls to you and longs for you to come to God, as much as he longs for you to know his love, he also longs for you to share that love, knowing that when you do so, you will encounter the very real, true presence of God. And my friends, when you have encountered the presence of God, when you have come face to face with the living Christ, you will not be able to prove to a skeptic, but you will know in your own heart and beyond all doubt that God is real, that God is love, and that God loves you. Let us pray. Holy God, we thank you for your wonderful, marvelous love, for the fact that you give us brains that can doubt and hearts that can believe. And we ask now that you be with everyone who struggles with faith. Let them be confirmed in the presence of your love. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Goodbye, friends.